A key part of Smith's platform is a pledge to ignore federal legislation if Alberta MLAs decide it's not in the province's best interest. The new United Conservative Party leader is in Calgary. Danielle Smith, congratulations and welcome back to the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Last night on this program, your campaign manager said if you got a first ballot victory, you would have a crystal clear mandate. You won on the sixth ballot. So how would you describe the clarity of your mandate right now?
Oh, it was a hard-fought race. I can tell you there were such good candidates in the race with great ideas, and they certainly made me work for it right to the very end. And so the building and the unity comes after a hard-fought contest like this. We already had a caucus meeting this morning, and I can tell you that the caucus is united in wanting to defeat the NDP in the next election. So I think that you will see some of those divisions get healed up pretty quickly.
It was about 53.8% for you, 46.2% for Travis Taves on the final ballot. So you say the caucus may be united in trying to stop the NDP, but are they necessarily united behind your agenda? I wonder if this result is enough to go ahead with something seen by a lot of people as radical with your Sovereignty Act.
Well, I campaigned on three issues. I didn't want to have a huge agenda because I am very deferential to caucus and wanting to get buy-in. And so I campaigned on reforming Alberta Health Services, as well as changing the Human Rights Act to make sure we do not discriminate against people on the basis of their vaccination choice. And my approach to how we deal with Ottawa and having constant incursions into our areas of jurisdiction was the Sovereignty Act. But I must say, all the other candidates also identified that pushing back against Ottawa was a priority. We had slightly different ways of going about doing it. The reason I like the approach on the Sovereignty Act, though, is that we see that this is the kind of approach that other provinces already take in defending their areas of jurisdiction. And I think it will stand up as we go through the process of drafting it with the help of constitutional lawyers. So I'm looking forward to implementing that in the fall.
We've seen other provinces use things like the notwithstanding clause to enact legislation, but I don't know if we've seen them push back the way the Sovereignty Act is being sort of portrayed. I mean, picking a fight with Ottawa is one thing, but picking and choosing which laws will be enforced is something quite different.
Well, the way I got the idea for it, really, and the approach that I want to take was looking at what Quebec did when the Emergencies Act was declared. They convened their National Assembly, they put forward a motion that said we will not enforce that, and it passed unanimously and didn't create a constitutional crisis. Looks to me like Ottawa just said, okay. So Quebec does this kind of thing in different ways, and I thought that was a pretty good mechanism. So when we identify an issue where we feel like Ottawa has overstepped into our constitutional authority, we'll put forward a motion in the legislature and have that debate as well. But I need to create the structure in place so that Ottawa knows they're being put on notice, that we're not going to allow this anymore. We're not going to act like a subordinate level of government. We've done that for too long, and we're getting walked all over as a result. So we intend to make sure that we assert our rights.
Okay, I want to pick up on that example because I remember that resolution by the Quebec National Assembly, but that's not quite what it said. Mm-hmm. It was a unanimous resolution asking Ottawa not to enforce the Emergencies Act inside Quebec territory. It was not a motion saying they would not enforce it because there was a recognition that that is exclusively the federal government's right and authority and power under the Emergency Act. So it's not quite as you're describing it.
I don't think that it was enforced in Quebec. Part of what we're seeing still in our province is that people's bank accounts are being seized, and so I'm very concerned about that. I've also seen that there are other examples in the province. I've seen British Columbia, they don't enforce any of our drug laws for criminal possession. In fact, they just asked for an exemption from the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. We've seen all three of our provinces now, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, say that they are not going to enforce the federal confiscation scheme for firearms, that our policing priorities, which are provincial jurisdiction, fall into the area of going after gang violence and making sure that smuggled guns are apprehended, not taking away legally purchased firearms from firearms owners. So I would say that we have this constant conversation with the federal government about when we perceive that they're invading our jurisdiction. And those are just recent examples. I probably could go back and find a few more.
Right, but I just want to cycle back to the Quebec example. That was a symbolic resolution. That had no legal weight. There was no way Quebec could stop the federal government from enforcing the Emergencies Act if they chose to do it based on this particular thing. So I wonder what the value is of the Sovereignty Act if it's going to follow what really was a symbolic motion by the Quebec legislature rather than an actual legal battle with the federal government.
Well, I think what happens is when we indicate that we are not going to enforce, now the ball is in the federal court. I think what we see with the federal government, and I can give an example with Bill C-69, where they have interfered in our areas of jurisdiction. They've essentially unilaterally rewritten the Constitution according to a court decision that came in Alberta. They just make us continue to fight to get our rights back. All 10 provinces are fighting the federal government on that. If we turn the tables and say, look, I'm sorry, we're not going to enforce legislation that invades our jurisdiction, it'll be up to them to take us to court, and we'd be able to fight those things out. They're the ones who could go through the expense and the challenge of taking us to court. But in the meantime, we're going to govern ourselves the way the Constitution was intended. The Constitution outlines a great number of areas that fall under provincial jurisdiction. Ottawa has no right to invade our sovereign jurisdiction in those areas that are exclusive to us. They do all the time, and we've let them, but that stops. We're not going to do that anymore.
There's a lot of constitutional experts out there who say that the way you've described the Sovereignty Act and how it would work is in fact unconstitutional, and that your assessment of how jurisdiction works and the division of legal authorities, it's not quite accurate when compared to the letter of the actual text. I mean, how do you respond to that criticism?
I think people should wait to see how it's written, because I took an idea that was put forward by a policy think tank, and I've worked very hard to start honing in and identifying the areas in which we can defend our constitutional rights. I think that this is maybe the difference, is that we have been acting like Ottawa calls all the shots on all areas, and they don't. Brian Peckford, who's the last living signatory to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Constitution, has said Ottawa has no more right to invade and legislate in our area of jurisdiction than we do in theirs. I don't think Ottawa's very respectful of provincial jurisdiction, and I hope we can change the conversation so that they are.
So let's go to this example of not enforcing the gun buyback, for example, and the various gun issues that you and Saskatchewan and Manitoba are on board with. You don't want the RCMP, which are performing contract policing services in those provinces, to enforce that. What if Ottawa sends in extra police to enforce it? What if they send in from their national detachment to start enforcing it? How do you respond if the federal government takes steps to enforce these federal laws over your objections?
Well, I think this is the interesting thing, isn't it? Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino has said without provincial cooperation, there really isn't a way to enforce it. So this is I guess, instructive to the federal government. They should stop passing laws that are unconstitutional and that they cannot enforce, and that are offside with the values and the priorities of the provinces. This is the conversation that we need to have. Is there's a lot of virtue signaling, I think, that happens, especially with this particular government. And if they cannot enforce the things that they would like to do, and it's not within their constitutional mandate, then they should rethink the legislation. I've received advice from a former judge that the gun control is provincial jurisdiction, policing is provincial jurisdiction, property and civil rights are provincial jurisdiction, and we are perfectly within our right to say, no, sorry, it is not our priority and we won't enforce that. And if they want to take it to another level, I guess we'll have to respond to that. But the ball is now in their court, because we've made it very clear that we are not going to follow their edict on this.
How is the Sovereignty Act not virtue signaling? Right now, you have no framework, you have no written legislation. You say you're going to do things that will just stop in the enforcement of laws you disagree with. I mean, isn't that just the other side of what you're accusing the Trudeau Liberals of doing?
You know, I think we have to behave like a grown-up province. Maybe this is the surprise that the rest of the country is seeing. That when we were a low-population province with a smaller economy, maybe we did rely on the federal government to assist us in our areas of jurisdiction. But we're 4.5 million people now, and we're the third largest economy, on our way to becoming the second largest economy. When you become a senior partner in Confederation, you start doing things differently. You start collecting your own income tax, you start having your own police service, you start collecting your own pension, you manage your own immigration, and you start asserting and pushing back that Ottawa doesn't need to provide their help anymore. So now that we're prepared to have a new and mature relationship with the federal government, I think it's important that they be put on notice that we intend to vigorously defend all of the areas of the Constitution that have been given to us by the founders and drafters of that original document.
You won the leadership. You're the premier-designate. You will move into the top office in the land quite soon, but you don't yet have a seat in the legislature. I know the MLA for Brooks has resigned to start a by-election, and you're exploring running there, but there was already a seat open in Calgary Elbow. Why would you go through the public expense of a by-election when there's a seat ready and available for you to run and get into the legislature?
Well, we're only going to have one by-election, so we'll be able to save on that expense. And I think that there is a convention that the Premier try to get into office as quickly as she possibly can. I think that we've had a couple of months delays in previous years when we've been in this situation before. But I think it's important for me to be there to introduce my legislation, and so we're going to try to limit the expense by having it be only one by-election, and I'm very hopeful that I'll be there by the end of November.
But why not just run in Calgary, Ms. Smith? I mean, it's there, was available, and you wouldn't have need to have this second seat become open.
Well, there's only one by-election that's going to be held, and so to me, I really like representing a rural riding. I think this is one of the problems that we have had, is that we have not listened to our rural voices, and I want our rural communities to know that we are going to make sure that we are responsive to their needs, and I think there's no better way of doing that than running in a rural riding.
Okay, Danielle Smith, thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.